government daily press briefing on the coronavirus in full, every day on LBC News.
And we'll bring that to you live and uninterrupted from 5 o'clock. Let's turn our attention to the coronavirus pandemic in the United States, where the unemployment there, the rate of unemployment is now at the highest level since the Great Depression. Well, joining me live on LBC News is our US correspondent Simon Marks. Good afternoon, Simon.
Hello, Philip.
These figures, absolutely astonishing. Just how bad are they?
They're really bad. I mean, this is the first official confirmation that we've had that the United States is now in its steepest economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The numbers that were released today by the Bureau of Labor Statistics here in Washington, D.C., show that in the month of April, more than 20 million Americans lost their jobs. That's in April alone. That takes the unemployment rate in this country to 14.7%. On top of that, we know that there are millions of people that lost their jobs in March. So it looks like there are more than 33.3 million people without work in the United States today. And on top of that, it's absolutely evident that these job losses aren't over yet. There are still people losing their jobs in May. We'll get those numbers in a month's time. The difficulty, of course, that this creates for the Trump administration is that these jobs have been lost so rapidly, and this downturn is so deep that it will be absolutely impossible for the United States to pull itself out of this economic collapse with the same rapidity with which the collapse descended upon the United States. The recovery is going to be much slower than the immediate loss of jobs that we're witnessing here. And of course, this creates all sorts of enormous pressures. First of all, political pressures on the Trump administration. President Trump was giving an interview this morning just as these numbers were being published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He was talking to Fox News. He said that these numbers were absolutely expected, totally in line with forecasts. He again urged Americans to give him the opportunity to rebuild America's economy. He's got his eye firmly on the November elections here. But, you know, it is going to be extremely difficult for the president to move forward at full tilt with the reopening of the country that he wants to see, while the ultimate decision about reopening is left to 50 disparate governors all over the country of varying talents, abilities and political outlooks. And while public health officials are warning with increasing seriousness about the prospect of a second wave of infections here if restrictions are lifted too rapidly. There's also, of course, just the psychological impact of all of this on America. More than 30 million people unemployed in a country that President Trump likes to say wasn't built to have people staying at home worrying about how they're going to pay their bills. How all this plays out is undoubtedly now going to be the story of America's presidential elections throughout 2020.
And you mentioned there about the lockdown and the calls for it to be eased and people out of work. It's just a double-edged sword. How do you see the country even trying 1% to try and move towards getting out of this with the death rate increasing?
Well, I mean, very slowly is the way in which public health officials want this to occur. There are models out there that we've seen this week from both the Centers for Disease Control and the University of Washington predicting a sharp increase in the death rate here. The Centers for Disease Control believes that by the end of this month, more than 3,000 Americans a day will be losing their lives to coronavirus. I mean, that's like a 9/11 attack every single day taking place in the United States. The country's already lost more people to COVID-19 than it lost during the Vietnam War. The University of Washington study argued that restrictions being lifted will lead to a doubling in the number of deaths here. Now, President Trump has said that he understands that people will die as a result of the lockdowns being lifted and relaxed. His argument is that people are dying at home. He says there's an increase in the suicide rate in the United States as people realize they've lost their livelihoods, that mental health issues are becoming pronounced in many American towns and cities as people deal with the restrictions that have been imposed. His political opponents, the Democrats, of course, say this takes leadership. Donald Trump doesn't have it. He hasn't got the qualities necessary to lead the country out of this. And they point even to the interview that he gave this morning as these jobs numbers were being published. No expression of compassion, no expression of empathy for those millions of families all over the country wondering how on earth they are going to pay their bills. Instead, the routine insistence, as he does every single day, that by the fourth quarter of this year, the economy is going to be roaring ahead because there's so much pent-up demand. It's going to be raging, he said the other day. Well, that's not the way economists see it. They think you can only get to the raging part of the economy if you have testing in place, if you've got contact tracing in place, if you do all of the things that so far the US government has largely failed to do in tackling this coronavirus crisis.
And finally, Simon, President Trump, he's again claimed that the Wuhan, city of Wuhan in China, that's where the virus originated from in a laboratory. But this time, has the president offered any evidence that it's come from a laboratory in Wuhan?
No, and he slightly changed his tune on this today. Again, in that interview with Fox News, President Trump has said that the virus was concocted in that Wuhan laboratory. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, just a few days ago said that there is enormous evidence to show that the virus emerged from the lab. Last week, the president was inferring in radio interviews here that he believed the virus was deliberately released by the Chinese so that they could destroy America's economy. Today, he's saying that he doesn't think that it was deliberately released from the lab. He thinks that something accidental may have occurred. He said yesterday in a very brief exchange with reporters on the subject, maybe somebody did something stupid at the laboratory. Now, the Chinese are rejecting all of this. They called Mike Pompeo insane for making those comments earlier in the week. They are demanding that the Trump administration publish any evidence that it's got supporting the claim that this virus was man-made and emerged from that Wuhan lab. The Trump administration has been promising now for days to put some kind of evidence or supporting information into the public domain. They still haven't done it. President Trump says that he feels as though his relationship with China is now much tougher than it was. And he indicated today that he's changing his views about his approach to China. But where all of this sort of evolving stream of consciousness foreign policy goes, I think we won't know, but it is pretty clear that between now and November the 3rd, Election Day here in the United States, President Trump and his senior figures within the White House are going to point the finger of blame at China. It's only a question of the detailed telling of that particular story that I think we still need to understand.
OK, Simon Marks, LBC News US correspondent, thank you for joining me this afternoon, particularly on those unemployment rate levels as well in the United States, now at the highest since the Great Depression, as Simon was giving us reaction and analysis too.